This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Before the show, we measured out roughly 6 feet from the camera to my desk. Hopefully that'll put you at ease as I invite myself into your home this evening. Here's what we got for y'all. Floridians got a chance to cast their ballots today as the first day of early voting kicked off in most of the state. We'll tell you more about voting in a consequential state for this presidential election. Plus, many English language conspiracy theories are also common in Spanish, and now experts are concerned about the spread of disinformation and what impact it'll have on susceptible Spanish-speaking voters. But first, here's what you need to know right now. The world surpassed 40 million coronavirus cases today. Right now, the US is averaging more than 52,000 new cases a day, with some areas seeing case counts soar to the highest rates seen since July. In more than 40 states, hospitalizations increased as well. This comes as the weather gets colder and holidays get closer.
You kind of think about the country as a gigantic forest. And when there's fires in one part of the forest, the other part of the forest is vulnerable. So if you want to get control of things, we've got to be consistent. We've got to do things with the ultimate purpose of getting control over the outbreak. And unfortunately, we haven't done that as well as I think we could.
Right now, the United States, India, and Brazil are the top 3 affected countries in the world. Okay, this is starting to feel like the movie Groundhog Day. Lawmakers are working to get a stimulus deal passed before Election Day. We've heard that before. After months of back and forth, lawmakers say this will actually be the last attempt. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says details needed to be ironed out by Tuesday to get anything passed before Election Day, which is just 15 days away.
We're saying to them, we have to freeze the design on some of these things. Are we going with it or not? And what is the language? I'm optimistic.
Tomorrow, the Senate plans to hold a vote on a standalone Paycheck Protection Program bill to help small businesses. On Wednesday, they will vote on the slimmed-down $500 billion stimulus bill. But here's the thing. Democrats blocked something similar last month in an attempt to push for something bigger. Since not much has changed, the vote is expected to go similarly. The Supreme Court says it will take up cases challenging 2 border policies implemented by the Trump administration. One of those deals with the policy requiring asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while they wait for hearings in the US. Lower courts struck down that policy, but the Supreme Court is allowing it to stay in effect pending appeals. The other case has to do with the border wall. The Trump administration wants to use $2.5 billion in Pentagon funds to build more barriers at the wall. Lower courts argue the administration does not have that power. The Supreme Court won't actually hear the cases until next year. In the meantime, construction on the wall can continue. Early voting has begun in several states, and more than 27 million ballots have already been cast. Some Floridians got their chance to get to the polls Monday, and depending on which part of the state you lived in, that experience might have been more dry for some than for others. Newsy's Stephanie Liebergen has more on early voting in Florida, a state that's indicated the presidential election winner for almost the last 30 years.
Floridians lined up to vote Monday as the first day of in-person voting kicked off in most of the state.
I request my ballot by mail and I didn't get it, so now I'm here today.
I think this election is probably in my lifetime for sure, the most important election that we've ever had. I think we become prisoners of the moment where we think every election's that way, but I actually believe that this election is going to impact generations.
For some in South Florida, that meant waiting hours in the rain.
Well, I was excited. I've been excited for months. I woke up and I was like, it's the 19th. I can go early vote.
Voters here in Miami-Dade County play a crucial role in deciding who gets the state's 29 electoral votes. To give you an idea of just how important Florida is, no candidate has won the White House without winning Florida since 1992.
Florida is essentially a microcosm of the country in terms of its demography, its industries, so as goes Florida, tends to go the rest of the nation.
The race in Florida is a tight one, according to the Real Clear Politics polling average, with only a couple of points separating Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and President Donald Trump from week to week. And both presidential candidates have made their pitches to voters here.
We're going to win the state of Florida. It's good to be back in Florida.
Their attention has been focused on a key demographic, seniors.
Biden's agenda would be a catastrophe for Florida seniors. This president cares more about the stock market than he does about, well-being of seniors.
Vice President Mike Pence also traveled to Florida earlier this month, and Senator Kamala Harris visited the state on Monday.
Today, I had to come here on the kickoff of early voting in Florida, because y'all are going to make it happen.
Early in-person voting didn't start for all Floridians on Monday. State law doesn't require elections officials to offer it until October 24th. Now, the Sunshine State is also expecting a high number of mail-in ballots this year. Before polls opened on Monday for early in-person voting, over 2.5 million Floridians had already cast their ballots. Stephanie Liebergen, Newsy, Miami.
There's a notable difference in how we power walk and how Dr. Anthony Fauci has to power walk these days.
There's 3 American girls competing for the top 2 Olympic spots.
I could go into this and come out with nothing.
The eyes are the window to the soul. Twitter is the window to that house that's on fire with the dog inside who's like, everything is fine. Here's what's trending. In a wide-ranging 60 Minutes interview this weekend, we learned a few interesting tidbits from Dr. Anthony Fauci, including that he wasn't surprised to learn of Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis after seeing the president interacting with crowds of supporters and little social distancing. He's still doing that, by the way. But what's really been burning up the interwebs isn't anything from this week's Fauci interview, but actually a clip from 4 years ago when he told 60 Minutes about his worst fear as an infectious disease expert, which in hindsight is some pretty wild foreshadowing.
An influenza-like respiratory-borne virus that's easily transmittable, to which the population of the world has very little, if any, immunity against, and that has a high degree of morbidity and mortality, something similar to the very tragic pandemic flu of 1918.
Now, predictably, some people on the social media fringe saw this interview and saw a conspiracy, but the simpler takeaway is the more accurate one. Basically, public health experts saw this kind of pandemic coming, and the world still wasn't prepared. If you were looking for a world news headline, we got you covered. Bolivia is trending after a movement towards Socialism Party candidate Luis Arce declared victory in their presidential election. This election is a redo of last year's election, which was called off due to widespread claims of election fraud that then led to mass protests and former President Evo Morales being exiled from the country by security forces. Arce previously worked as Morales' finance minister. The Trump administration had initially celebrated Morales' removal. State Department said Monday they look forward to working with whomever the Bolivians elect. If you spend any time on Twitter or various other social media platforms, you might be familiar with BTS. If you're not, let me tell you, this Korean boy band is a worldwide sensation with a social media army second to none. And that's especially obvious following a bit of geopolitical controversy the band stirred up with this speech, accepting an award for contributing to the relationship between the US and South Korea.
We will always remember the history of pain that our 2 nations share together and the sacrifices of countless men and women.
Seems reasonable enough. But apparently some fans and some non-fans in China aren't too happy about what they see as a slight to their country, which was on the other side of that South Korean conflict. Both Chinese and South Korean press have weighed in on the dust-up, even drawing a statement from a spokesman for the Chinese government. This all seems like a bit of an overreaction, but it does show both the sensitive relationship between China and South Korea and this boy band's surprising political influence. Disinformation has been pretty rampant this election cycle, and some conspiracy theories like QAnon have even reached Spanish-speaking communities. And in some cases, they're delivered with a twist, nodding to Latin American politics. According to Newsy's Ben Chamiso, experts are worried about the effect of disinformation and conspiracy theories on susceptible voters.
Disinformation targeting Latino voters in Spanish is spreading wildly across social media and airwaves.
Stories of elites having control over the American political system.
They're accusing Black Lives Matter of being dominated by voodoo.
Many Spanish language conspiracy theories, such as QAnon, are common in English too, but observers are also seeing increasing lies linking Joe Biden or President Trump to different regimes in Latin America.
When you connect one candidate, doesn't matter if it's Trump or Biden, to a politician that is the reason why you fled the country or is the reason why you can't be with your family. I mean, this is really emotional.
Experts tracking the phenomenon in South Florida and elsewhere worry about its impact on communities that may be particularly susceptible to disinformation.
You have a community that is still getting a sense of, what credible journalism looks like in a new country.
News outlets, intelligence agencies, and big tech companies have been devoting enormous resources in recent years to fight disinformation in English. But analysts say disinformation in Spanish has been largely left unchecked.
I had friends and family members who were sharing stories that would never, I think, pass the muster of what you would observe in terms of English language news.
The fact that it would go so mainstream is what bothers me.
But as the election nears, new fact-checking efforts in Spanish are finally emerging. On Univision,
Univisión Noticias relanza hoy su unidad de chequeo de datos a 46 días de las elecciones presidenciales.
And on Telemundo.
Pero nuestro equipo de Te Verifica revisó cada palabra de los aspirantes.
Besides doing their own fact-checking, the two major broadcasters have also started translating fact-checking articles from other outlets, such as The Washington Post, PolitiFact, and USA Today. All the content they write and translate is then uploaded onto a new WhatsApp chatbot called Fact Chat. The free service allows Spanish-speaking users to easily search for fact-checking content.
We are seeing very big hits on debate nights because we are offering live content, which is pretty cool for something that is on WhatsApp.
Researchers say it's difficult to assess how exactly the surge of Spanish language disinformation is impacting the election. But they say one thing is clear: it's sowing doubt on a political system that many are still getting used to.
The concern is not so much that this disinformation changes people's minds in terms of persuading them, but rather that it might encourage doubt and anxiety that might make them less likely to participate.
Ben Chamizo, Newsy.
In a country where elections are decided on thin margins, millions of Americans aren't being allowed to cast their ballots.
As the coronavirus has quickly spread across the world,
a freeze on travel has the potential to reshape why people fly.
This halt in traditional entertainment highlights how viewers and creators are coping together.
Healthcare systems in the U.S. will need 3.5 billion masks.
The economic damage looks very different on either side of the Atlantic.
There are only about 117,000 beds nationwide.
When can we get back to normal?
We spent a lot of time talking about who's voting and how people are voting this election cycle. At least 75% of Americans are eligible to get a mail-in ballot this year. Not included in that number, people with felony convictions. Most of them have left prison but still can't cast a ballot. Newsy's Jamal Andrews tells us more about felony disenfranchisement ahead of this election and who is impacted the most.
According to a new study, more than 5 million people will not be allowed to vote in the 2020 election because of a felony conviction. That's 2.3% of the total voting age population, a big percentage in a country where elections are routinely decided by razor-thin margins. And while some of these potential voters are incarcerated, the vast majority, nearly 75%, are out of prison and living in the community.
Every day, there's a steady assembly line going through the justice system.
Criminologist and professor Christopher Eugen conducted this study for the Sentencing Project.
And the question is, do they ever come off of that line and rejoin the rest of us in society as, citizens standing shoulder to shoulder on election day?
A lot of that depends on the state you live in. There's only 2 states that permit you to vote no matter what involvement you've had with the criminal justice system: Maine and Vermont.
As it happens in my own state of Vermont, from the very first days of our state's history, what our Constitution says is that everybody can vote. That is true. So people in jail can vote. But I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people.
But for states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, more than 8% of the state's population can't vote because of their criminal record. Florida was one of the last 2 states in the country that banned former felons from voting for life before passing a major referendum in 2018 to change that. Amendment 4 gave 1.4 million former felons the right to vote. But shortly after the law passed, Republican lawmakers added a restriction, forcing voters to pay any outstanding fines, fees, or restitution before they could cast their ballot.
There's a lot of people, a lot of returning citizens in Florida that are now being forced to choose between putting food on their kids' plate or voting, right? Being forced to choose between paying rent or their mortgage or voting, or their light bill or voting, right? And we believe that access to the ballot box should be unencumbered and free.
According to the Sentencing Project, this new law will keep more than 900,000 Floridians from voting this November. Yugen makes a direct link between the disparities in the criminal justice system and felony disenfranchisement, saying one reinforces the other.
What we've been talking about with Black Lives Matter and law enforcement and courts and racial discrimination and criminal justice, that is all amplified and transmitted through the political process by the practice of disenfranchisement.
According to the Sentencing Project, 1 in every 16 voting-age Black Americans nationwide is disenfranchised. That rate is nearly 4 times higher than non-Black Americans. Jamal Andrus, Newsy, Chicago.
If you haven't already, give us a shout on Twitter using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. I can't really offer anything in return, but I'm usually a pleasant conversationalist. Usually. Protests for racial justice in the wake of high-profile police killings of Black people have spurred some companies to action. Businesses have pledged to fight racism by doing things like making donations or promising increased diversity internally. I mean, it's kind of the flavor of the month, and only time will tell if companies are actually committed to these promises or if they're just faux woke business maneuvers. But at least one company is tying their progress to the salaries of their executives. Newsy's Kat Sandoval tells us about a new diversity plan brewing at Starbucks.
Next year, Starbucks will tie their executive salaries to diversity goals. And while they're not specific on exactly how their salaries will be affected, they are clear on their goals. By 2025, they plan on having 30% of their corporate levels and 40% of their retail and manufacturing roles to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Right now, minorities make up less than 20% of senior vice president positions or higher. Compare that to the U.S. population. People of color make up around 40%.
You have to start asking if we've been trying our hardest for a decade and a half, and we've seen some progress, but not a ton of progress. So maybe we should rethink not just soft incentives, but harder incentives like Starbucks.
Lorena Yee leads Women in the Workplace Diversity Studies. She says there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. For Starbucks, diversity initiatives have increased after 2 Black men were racially profiled by a Starbucks barista in Philadelphia 2 years ago.
It's not a one solution, one problem, one solution type of situation.
Yee says some companies saw success through incentives like recognition or bonuses instead of financial penalties. Starbucks' push for diversity may make other companies rethink their approach to diversity.
Some of the questions universally companies should be asking is, might I want to look harder at incentives? Might I want to look harder at transparency? Are my goals ambitious enough? Have I created fair evaluations and promotion practices?
The diversity gender wage gap also starts at the beginning. A McKinsey study found for every 100 men that are promoted from entry-level positions, only 71 of Latinas and 58 of Black women are promoted. And he says the coronavirus is adding extra pressure for women to leave the workplace.
This idea that we could have a gender recession in front of us is really alarming.
Kat Sandoval, Newsy, Chicago.
It's been a record-breaking year for natural disasters across the country. So far, there have been 17 natural disasters, and each one has cost more than $1 billion in damages. National reporter Maya Rodriguez looks into what's behind these high-cost disasters and what can be done to deal with them.
Louisiana, a state dealing with not one, but two multi-billion-dollar natural disasters within the span of 6 weeks. Hurricanes Laura and Delta.
This family here just moved in less than a week ago. They're just getting settled in, haven't even put all their things in place, and they're having to move out until we can get it repaired.
Up until Hurricane Delta, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said the country experienced 16 natural disasters this year with damages over $1 billion, from fires and droughts in the west to tornadoes and flooding in the Midwest and hurricanes along the east and Gulf coasts. 16 tied the record for the most ever recorded in a single year. That is, until Hurricane Delta broke the record with at least $2 billion in damages.
The overall trend is one of an increasing number of billion-dollar disasters.
Jeff Slegamilch heads up Columbia University's National Center for Disaster Preparedness. He says there are two main reasons we're seeing more of these high-priced natural disasters. The first, climate change.
But to deny climate change is to deny one of the critical drivers of these disasters.
The other reason, he says, where people choose to live. The population is growing, leading to more development in vulnerable areas, like in hurricane-susceptible coastlines and in wooded areas susceptible to wildfires.
Are we prepared to accommodate such large numbers of people in areas that are increasingly vulnerable to disasters? And if not, what investments do we need to make in order to do that?
That might mean putting stricter building codes in place, he says, and rethinking disasters beyond just responding to them when they happen, the way FEMA and states do now.
So looking at this more holistically, I don't think we yet have a great model for doing this federally or at the states or at the community level.
But it's more than just about the numbers when it comes to billion-dollar disasters.
And what we don't really capture as accurately within those numbers are the loss of lives, the loss of livelihoods, and the communities that can actually be held back for a generation or more.
Impacts felt both now and potentially by generations that follow. I'm Maya Rodriguez reporting.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with more In the Loop. Same time, same place. Top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.